Welcome to this Learn at Work webinar founded by Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation, published by iOS Press. I'm Karen Jacobs. I'll be the moderator, and I'm the founding editor of Work. I'm delighted today to have this extremely interesting webinar by Amy and Daniel. And so I'm just going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves and begin the webinar. So thank you again for being here.
Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself first? And then I'll introduce myself. Thank you.
Welcome and good morning from Seattle. I think good afternoon to the East Coast. I'm Daniel Winterbottom. I'm a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Washington and have been collaborating with Amy on various projects and teaching endeavors for the last 10 years pretty much, and focused very much on the use of nature as a therapeutic intervention across the board, but specifically in this case, we'll be talking about in prisons.
Yes, and thank you, Daniel. And hello, everyone. I'm Amy Wagenfeld, and I'm faculty in Boston University's Post-Professional Occupational Therapy doctoral program. And would like to add that Daniel and I are co-authors of a book called Therapeutic Gardens, Designed for Healing Spaces, which was published in 2015 by Timber Press. And it's a joy for us to work together. Okay, so we have a bit of a busy agenda today, and we'll be talking to you about the format in which we set up and facilitated a very, very interesting interdisciplinary studio class looking at designing the outdoor environments at a women's prison not so far from Seattle, Washington. So this project, and Daniel gets full credit for hanging in there for the duration of 6 years in working, tirelessly with Washington Corrections Center for Women to develop this project. It was a lot of back and forth discussions, many, many years, and finally, bingo, we were able to move forward with the design process. And the class itself was offered through, and it was funded primarily by the College of the Built Environment at University of Washington. And as I mentioned before, this was an interdisciplinary studio, and primarily the students in the class were from landscape architecture and architecture programs. And then there was me, the occupational therapist. We were also very, very fortunate in regards to the studio class was to have input from a design firm called the DLR Group and the Seattle office, and particularly their justice group. They came, quite many members of their design team came regularly to class to help us better understand some of the research that's out there about correctional facility design, and also shared their professional practice expertise with our students. We also collaborated with Pioneer Human Services, which is it's a vocational training program for offenders post-release. So we were fortunate to spend some time over at Pioneer Human Services, our class, and as well, we were very fortunate in being able to recruit some of the participants in their program to come to the university and review our students' work. And of course, part of the background that's associated with this project is we definitely had to work on prison time. There was many, many, many obstacles along the way that we had to deal with, and it was sort of a lifelong learning lesson for our students to be flexible, to know that things will get canceled, they'll get rescheduled, and to just have to adjust to prison time.
So we established a number of goals at the beginning of the project, and we're pretty much able to maintain them throughout. The first was to understand and apply principles of therapeutic and culturally sensitive design. This is something that we really had to spend quite a bit of time educating the administrators and the staff, as well as working with the women that were incarcerated there to understand what that was, and then of course how to do that. To understand the underlying health conditions associated with incarnation. They're huge. Stress is certainly one of the most obvious ones. It's an extremely stressful environment. There's also the displacement and people's disconnection from family. There is a lot of mental health and addiction issues that go along with this population. So part of that was explaining to the students exactly what the constant conditions were from both a mental and a physical health standpoint while being incarcerated. To understand the purpose and the settings of incarceration, there's different viewpoints, obviously. The administration has one idea, state authorities have other ideas, and of course families and those serving time have different ideas, and to create feasible solutions that would increase the benefits of environmental design. I say feasible, but it was also to try to push the thinking around incarceration and what the environment could be, is, and should be. The approach to design via multiple viewpoints. Certainly there's different ages, there's different gender associations, there's different ethnicities. So we're really trying to take a holistic approach from how that would be viewed and what their needs might be. Continue to develop skills in design collaboration. This was collaboration for the most part between the students, but as Amy said, it was interdisciplinary. But we also did have opportunities to collaborate with those serving time. So that was also a skill that was developed through the studio. Develop a deeper understanding of the design process and how it can improve the lives of the marginalized populations. This was, I think, somewhat successful, but we all come with our own lens and we all come with our own values and prejudices to a certain degree. And those have to be changed, transformed, and put to the side very often to truly understand how the other is living and the other's needs. And that was a challenge, certainly in this project. I talked about multiple points of view, and then of course, multitasking. So we're doing master plans, we're also doing site design, we're also looking at the feasibility of it. We're also trying to be realistic about what the authorities will accept, because the idea was that this project will eventually become a design build project that we'll be able to implement within the facility post-COVID.
Thanks, Daniel. So in terms of the organizational structure for the class, we had 3 instructors for the class. Of course, Daniel, we had an architect in practice who had a background in correctional design, and myself. So this wonderful interdisciplinary lens through which the seminar or the studio was facilitated, I think really enriched the quality of the learning experiences for the students. And so, but the collaboration also extended, as we had mentioned, between the 3 of us, as well as practitioners. Again, we were so fortunate to have those in practice from the DLR group and post offenders. You know, what an important viewpoint the post offenders could share with our students. This is a lived experience for them. And the class itself was comprised of 6 research and precedent teams. That's how we began the studio. And then 6 interdisciplinary design teams. So after we completed, the students completed their research and presented the research to the class, they were regrouped into design teams to begin to create their master plans. So the structure of the studio, as I mentioned, what we began with sort of learning about correctional institutions, if you will, as well as precedent of study of research and looking at prisons in various places, both in the Americas, in the Northern Americas, South America, Southern United States. We looked at exemplar prisons in various areas in Europe, and also in East Asia, looking at what really stands out about some of these prisons with regard to maximizing the use of the outdoor spaces. So the students were engaged in a lot of research and readings on both the penal system itself, as well as I mentioned, the outdoor environments at some of these prisons. We were, some of the students were able to do a site visit to the Washington Corrections Center for Women. It was not the whole group as we had hoped, but just representatives from each of the design groups. And we all as a class, as I mentioned, attended Pioneer Industries to talk with, to learn more about their program and to talk with some of the offenders about their thoughts of their experiences. We did a master plan, a midterm review in which we did have ex-offenders as well as architects and landscape architects in practice, as well as those from the DLR group. And of course, we had to, in winter of 2019 in Seattle, we had to deal with snowpocalypse, which set us back a lot of days because the university was closed. And so then after we got through the midterm, we had a very, very fast final push for developing a very cohesive master plan and site design for WCCW.
So the studio process, as Amy said, began with the orientation. This was really talking about incarceration, trying to get students to understand what the process was, how this institution specifically worked, and what some of the challenges were going to be. Some of those we knew, and of course, some of those we had to adapt to. All this was to understand what incarceration was like for those inside. Really, the pioneer connection was critical in that aspect because
Absolutely.
people had been incarcerated, both at the federal level, at the state level, and in the jail system, were able to talk directly to the students about that.
Right, because no matter how much you read, it doesn't equate to really understanding, you know, from others what that actual lived experience is.
It also, to some degree, transformed the fear because, of course,
yes.
the underlying thing is many of us see these as the other, and that they're
That's
there
right.
for a good reason, that they've done something heinous, and their human character is flawed at best and non-existent at worst. And this really was meeting people that look like us or them, and you know, had experiences that were at times very common, but made some pivotal mistakes and are trying to redeem themselves in most cases through this program.
Yeah, and if I could just add, Daniel, that, you know, from speaking with the students in our studio class, none of them had any experience with incarceration, either personally or with family members or those they knew. So this was a very, very unique opportunity for them to, as Daniel said, to see them as others. They're just us.
I also might add, and I don't mean to detour, but it's also an issue of some students really feel that we should abolish incarceration. So there was some ethical and sort of moral questions about if we should be doing this and if this was going to be eye candy used by the authorities and the administrators to sort of appease people's concerns about the treatment of people when they are incarcerated. We then, as Amy said, did precedents, and the precedents were absolutely critical because many countries are significantly more advanced in how they view the environment as rehabilitation to reduce recidivism instead of a punitive attitude that is predominant in this country.
Right, and to also, you know, with that understanding, to be providing vocational training and skills training for once one is on the outside.
Absolutely. And then we also, of course, covered the theory of therapeutic environments, nature engagements, which is quite extensive, and we're able to at least give a fundamental basis for that approach. So one question is, what is the role can landscape architecture play within a facility such as WCCW? And part of what we're trying to do is really ask not just the students, but those in charge of the facility, and these are the wardens, the assistant wardens and administrators, to think what could happen within their environment and what the benefits would be. And I'll jump a little ahead to the end. I was really quite moved with how receptive they were. I didn't expect it. At first, they were somewhat tentative in their openness towards us. I think they were really wondering how they would be looked upon if they decided to embrace this. By the end of it, and I'll talk about it at the end of the presentation, that completely changed.
So as I mentioned, the students were engaged. There were 6 groups of student research teams looking at different regions throughout the world. And what they were looking at is for real precedent exemplar examples of prisons that really recognize and value the the therapeutic benefits of engaging with nature, be it through various gardening programs, through agriculture programs. And this research, as Daniel mentioned, was really critical and pivotal for the students to understand how their design projects needed to shape up in order to be designed, if you will, to really maximize the therapeutic benefits of nature while in a very closed system, and to enable this access to be available, but within an environment that's safe and sort of meets all the very stringent requirements, security requirements of a correctional institution.
And you can see in this slide at the bottom some of the analysis. So
Yes.
they both looked at it critically, but they also looked at it from a curriculum standpoint. What were the programs and what were they accomplishing, and what was the variety of different approaches that different cultures took through both incarceration, but also the use of nature within the setting, within an incarceration setting. So this is one that Amy, do you want to go?
Oh, no, go ahead, and I'll chime
Okay.
in a little bit.
Okay, this is maybe one of the most famous facilities. It is located in Halden, Norway, right on the border with Sweden. What's interesting is this is a facility, it is a maximum security facility, but it was carved out from the woods being the indigenous environment, as you probably are well aware of, in Norway. So they were able to maintain quite a bit of the woods, as you can see in the plan in the upper left image. To the right side of that plan, a substantial amount of the forest was kept intact. So the buildings were sited within the forest. Forest was left between the buildings, but the walking paths and the recreational areas are meandering through the woods with various activities located within that environment. So this idea of being engaged with nature occurs both physically in the yard, but also, as you can see in the lower right, they've also framed views of nature. And there's much evidence that views of nature reduce stress, have a calming benefit, as well as many others psychologically as well as physically for people that are in high stress environments. You can see they've also done some small courtyard gardens, in this case a Zen garden in the middle bottom image. And then the upper right, they have physical exercise stations throughout the environment, which the inmates can use. It is a relatively small prison in comparison to American prisons. It's about 450 of a population. One big difference is they don't have life imprisonment. They don't have capital punishment. So the expectation is every inmate will be released. And the idea is to rehabilitate them so they will go out better than when they came in. And as you can see, this is partly imbued in their idea of environmental design.
Absolutely.
This one is in, you want to go, Amy? Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. This one is in Germany. And while some of the woods remain, as you can see, it has been cleared much more, a sort of traditional approach of making a prison. You cut down everything there and start from scratch. However, they have brought back a wetland, as you can see in the upper left. This is a source of both water for the irrigation. It's also a storm detention facility, but it also has a real wildlife attribute. This was one of the ones that engages farming and agriculture, which has a sordid past within American institutions, very often very similar to slave trade in what prisons were originally. However, it can also have enormous attributes. I worked in prisons in Massachusetts many years ago, and animals were one of the things that many of the inmates actually took to, and more so than interpersonal relationships with humans, because animals get pretty much unrequited love. I don't know about goats, but they get pretty interesting animals as well, as you can see. And then they also have these environmental games. You can see the large chests, greenhouses, etc. So again, it's really fostering growth, introspection, and social development among those who are incarcerated in these facilities.
Absolutely, and just very as Daniel said, these are just various opportunities to learn or to relearn skills, both vocational skills as well as social emotional engagement skills.
One thing I also might add is you look through these precedents is they have lots of places you could potentially hide things. And in the United States, there's a very strict adherence to that idea of a sort of swept clean landscape. And in Europe, there's a very different attitude. And I don't believe there's any higher incidences of violence or nefarious activities, even though they're much more permissive. This one is in UK, and you may be aware that UK is a center for gardens, the Chelsea Flower Show. Ironically, there are a couple prisons that have sort of swept the Chelsea Flower Awards. I think it's the Gold Cup or whatever the chief highest award you can get on a regular basis. But in Europe, or I'm sorry, in UK, very much the inmates are involved in learning the craft of both design and installation. So it's very much a vocational approach, but they also take great deal of pride in what they're doing and aspiring to a very top level. And many of them go into the trades of the horticulture business after being released. Interestingly, there are many facilities in England that are also open to the public. So they will have a garden area that often has a coffee store, coffee shop, or a little food area where they actually make the food, sell the food, and have a garden environment which is visited by the local community residents, which also diminishes the stigma for those being incarcerated because they actually have a presence within the community instead of being isolated from it.
Right, and that's such an important concept to grasp, is this connection that can be made. Go ahead, Daniel, and I'll just pop in.
Okay, sure. So they do a lot of cultivation of plant material in East Asia. In East Asia, again, it's very open policy in many of the facilities. These are probably medium to minimum, not necessarily maximum. They cultivate a lot of food and herbs and actually make the products. And then they also engage with the community, as I described before. In Thailand, for instance, they will have a sort of shopping area that is open on the weekends where their trade objects are sold, food is served, beverages are served, all run by the inmates, which is also part of a business acumen program. So they're going from soup to nuts to really complete this entire program. These are some examples of the foreign projects that they're doing in, I believe this is Southeast Asia. I'm not sure exactly which country it's in. Do you, Amy? Do you remember which country this was in?
I do not.
Okay.
Okay, so our project was at the Washington Correctional Center for Women, located in Gig Harbor, Washington, which is south of Seattle. The superintendent of the facility is Joe Wofford, and the facility's been around now for, gosh, 50 years. This facility houses over 700 women offenders, and there's minimum, medium, and close custody or maximum areas within the prison. This correctional facility is really wonderful, and it offers a real range of both educational programming and opportunities for offenders to really change and to transform themselves. And some of the programs include GED, information technology. There are work and vocational programs, and there's art-based programs, there's drafting programs, and of course, one of the standout projects or programs at the facility is the Sustainability in Prisons project, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Do you want to take this one, Daniel, or should I?
Sure, okay. So this is a bird's eye of the facility. It has a perimeter fence, as you can see, all around it. It's designated by the maximum, which is the bright red building you can see. It's the smallest population. You have medium, which is the yellow building in the upper right, which is probably the middle number of people serving their time there. And then you have the minimum, which is on the other side of the prison. It's low-rise buildings. You can see the one-story buildings, also in yellow, a little brighter yellow at the lower part of the plan. What's notable is that double fence that divides. So it's a divided prison with the maximum and medium on one side and the minimum on the other. Most, well, not most, but many of the offenders are going through these different stages. So they may start off in maximum. Before they're released, they end up in minimum. So there is some movement physically through them over years. One thing to note is there's a quad in the middle. You can see that red line. It's actually showing the approved circulation path from maximum to the dining hall. Where that red line ends is the dining hall. That quad is the educational quad serving the entire prison. So if somebody in minimum has to go to a class, they will cross through a double gate, 2 double gates actually, across that DMZ zone and into that quad. Conversely, should somebody from the other side have to come where the minimum is, they will do the same. There's also a quad for the medium. You can see that green rectangle sort of in front of the building. And then there's ancillary green spaces around the campus. The large green space in the middle of the minimum, again in the lower part of the screen, is substantially used by the Sustainability Prisons Project program, where the offenders are raising and propagating plants that are used for DOT or Department of Transportation projects for the most part. And these are native species that are being used to revegetate disturbed areas along roadways. They also have a horticulture program where they supply cut flowers, they raise cut flowers and create bouquets for state functions, dinners and the such, little irony there. And then they also have a horticulture program, which is, again, if you see that red line, there's the dining hall at the end of the red line. The building directly up from that is the educational building, and they have a highly esteemed and quite rigorous horticulture program serving about 60 of the women on a regular basis in classes for horticulture training.
And if I could just add, in the minimum security access area, there's a mother-child unit as well. So young children are able to stay with their mothers, which is just so critically important in terms of early development and attachment relationship building.
This just breaks down based on the use. I'll use my cursor, but again, this is the educational building here. This is this sort of semi-public. You enter the facility coming in, if you can see my cursor here, come through the fence, and then this is the visiting building, and it's also where your first, I'm sorry, it's the second checkpoint before you enter into the prison. The first checkpoint is right here, which is the initial entry into the complex. So this hopefully will give you a little bit of the reality of what's going on there. It's a little, I'm sorry, it was used for the presentation to the staff and the administration. But this, if you can see my cursor, is the minimum living. So it's relatively low buildings. There's 6 of them. Those are slated to be renovated, and they're actually going to be 2-story. But right now, they're 1-story. It's pretty much like a dormitory, to be honest with you. Bunk beds, they have shared spaces there. And then you can't see it because it's winter time, but all around the grounds, they're growing food and growing the propagation of the plants that I described earlier. Down below, this is an area that was for staff. It's a interior space that the staff can use for their breaks, and it was also an opportunity to use the outdoor space for respite for the staff because their situation is highly stressed as well, and to try to calm them and have a sense of escape so that they can rejuvenate their focus and attention was critical. There was an existing healing garden here. You can see it actually, I'm sorry, it's a small image. It's quite barren. It has some concrete benches, maybe 1 or 2 plants, and entirely paved. It's near the mental health unit, but that is what they described as their healing garden.
And unfortunately, it doesn't really meet the criteria of, providing that necessary experience for experiencing restoration and respite.
Exactly. Thank you. This is the quad that I talked about. It's a montage. It's the area right over here. So you can see it's quite open space flanked by buildings around it. This is the minimum area down here. And then this is the area that is fenced in. It was used for planting. It's right over here, and the maximum unit is right, I'm sorry, it's right here, and the maximum unit is right here. And that area, because it's fenced in, could in theory be a garden for those in maximum. Maximum is the highest level of restriction, and they have to have a CO all the time with them. But potentially that could actually be a green space that they could use without interaction with the rest of the population.
As we talked about, there are a number of standout programs at the facility. One that is gaining traction at many correctional institutions is a prison pet partnership. And sometimes it's based on, agricultural animals, but oftentimes it's things like dog grooming. What a wonderful skill to learn, and certainly useful when one is on the outside, if you will. And many prisons also offer the initial training for service animals. Other programs, as Daniel mentioned, they have a very standout ornamental horticulture program, and this is just, provides these amazing vocational skills for the women. There's also a prairie conservation nursery where plants are being cultivated and reused throughout the state. And again, the Sustainability in Prisons project is a very important standout program at the campus. And as I mentioned, there is the residential parenting program. And, for many women, being in prison when their young children are on the outside is absolutely devastating. And to have the opportunity for an offender to be with their young child and to learn really good parenting skills is really paramount for the future of both the parent as well as the child. And here we're up to the midterm review.
So the students, the studio took place over 10 weeks, and this is probably about week 6. They've done the precedent studies, they've done the research. We actually were able to visit the facility as Amy described. Yes. And what you're seeing, some of the students, yes, one from each of the team. There were 6 teams. So here they are presenting their work at the University of Washington. This was to selected professionals that would come in and review the work, that were familiar with designs for incarceration. And it also has some post-offenders that came to give feedback, so that the next 4 weeks were devoted to developing and refining their designs from these comments.
Just another image.
So as Amy mentioned, there were 6 teams and there were 6 proposals. The idea was to try to push the teams to do different approaches. The reason for that was we wanted to give a spectrum, which would reveal different approaches and different ideas that could be brought to the facility. These models are somewhat abstract, so they were very helpful because they were physical, so they showed the 3 dimensions. They also did much other work, but here you can see on the side. This is a later presentation when we actually went out to the facility, and these are the inmates that are looking at the models that the students had created. So what we're going to do is go through and talk about a few of the designs, not all of them, just to give you a sense of the diversity and the variety and how the students approached it. As Amy said, there were architects and landscape architects. So they were also bringing in principles of sustainable design, green building, and ecological healing. So this one is called Nature Adhesive. I think it sort of says everything that I could say. Subtitled The Beauty in Brokenness. I don't know if you're familiar with a concept called kintsugi. And kintsugi is an Asian concept, mainly in Japan, but also spreading throughout Asia, where a piece of ceramics has been broken and it is reconfigured using a gold glue or gold adhesive. And the idea is that the adhesive traces the wounds on the piece, but in so doing actually makes it more beautiful and also accepts the past of its trauma, let's put it that way. So it seemed extremely apt to a prison setting as a metaphor for what the offenders are going through. I don't know how many of you have been to a prison, but many of them come from pretty challenging backgrounds. In many cases, there's been institutionalized and generationalized abuse, drug use, alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you actually talk to these people, they're the first that are trying to break that cycle. Others come from very different backgrounds and may have other challenges that they're confronting, but all of them have been broken to some degree and they're trying to repair.
And all of them are experiencing trauma. And so the whole idea of healing and adhesive is so metaphorically apt.
So this project tried to create a sort of flow that unifies the facility. With the idea that it's all one system and that all of the people are suffering, whether they're maximum, medium, or minimum, and that the need for interaction with nature is equal to all. I would advocate actually this may be more important to the maximum because the maximum is the most isolating.
Yes.
They actually have the least light. The windows are little slits. It's the most stressed environment. It is the most violent offenders. So the idea of threat or confrontation is sort of permeated throughout the environment. So these are some details of what they did. It's a unifying paving that goes throughout, and then there's different garden rooms that are created. This is the large one with the education building here. So this would really be the learning garden. There's also some production gardens here. And the horticultural program is right here, and we'll be using these as both display and learning areas. This is the area for the maximum security. So they have these weaving pathways. The idea is that for maximum, they have to use a certain pathway. And the idea was that for the most part, that would be this brown pathway. But when a guard is there or they have the time, they could actually use this one, which would be a sensory pathway. So the idea is to have a hierarchy depending on time, security at that particular time, and access to nature on a more intimate level. The next one is called Self-Discovery and Recovery. And this one, the student team really focused on the mental health and physical health of the offenders. You can see they've shown some of their research. So 82% suffer from substance abuse, 53% from medical issues, 32% serious mental illness. And that means quite serious: schizophrenia, bipolar, etc. 80% were mothers. And then you can see some of the other statistics. So they cultivated their response based on the research that they had done. And this is what really rang out to them. They also wanted to use art and art therapy in their proposal. So that was interwoven throughout all of their proposals for the different degrees of security. So what's really nice about this proposal, I think, is that they've actually labeled, you can see here, art, cut flowers, individual spaces or social spaces, and then programmed each of the spaces. Again, I'm not going to show you everything that they've done, but these are some of the examples. So here you can see that the individual spaces, the social spaces, the art piece, etc., that are spread throughout the campus. This is actually the staff area. So this team focused very much on that one as well. And again, you can see individual, group, public art, And I don't know if they had cut flowers in that one or not. But they were able to program all of the activities throughout it and then connect some of those to the curriculum within the facility that was operating at the time. This is the main courtyard again. And this was really perceived as the place for both education. I forgot to mention, there's also the 12-step program is right here. So many of them cultivated a 12-step garden, which in this case is over here. Propagation gardens, display gardens, and learning gardens. Their idea was to use serpentine. They felt that it was a great counterpoint to the rectilinearity and the ordering, which defines a prison. You're told when to go, where to go, and how to go. And that this idea was that you would find yourself through this deviation from the regularity of the prison. They also did have this path. This connects the medium with the maximum and also connects to the dining hall. So at certain times, it may be that they're not permitted to use this or certain members of the population aren't. So this would be the straight run that could be monitored, easier, I guess you could say. And then this would be the more sensory and discovery path. This project looked at systems. So they're looking at natural systems, exercise as a system, social support as a system, and control as a system, or self-control, I guess you could say, as a system. So they were looking at those layers and how to integrate those within their proposal. One of the main systems they were looking at was water. That's become an important part in the state of Washington, is how we deal with water and water quality. And since this is a state institution, they're also mandated to begin to look at that. So you can see they've done an analysis of all the water collected from the impervious areas, or at least the rooftops of the buildings. And then that would inform how they would deal with the water on the site. So you can see here, this large courtyard becomes a detention, retention, and infiltration site for the water, as well as this lower one, which is the minimum. The idea was that water is valued as one of the highest therapeutic viewing opportunities and materials, plants being the other one. So water has both a very powerful therapeutic value. It has a huge ecological value. It attracts a lot of wildlife. It supports a whole range of pollinator plants. So it's really imbued in the ecological health, which is equated with the human health in this facility. I don't know if these are going to work. They did these little movies, which are, kind of primitive, but they give you a little sense of what it's like to be there. Again, this is the medium courtyard. So part of it is a forest ecology and part of it is a wetland ecology. Yeah, there you go. So, as well as a tennis court thrown in there for physical exercise. So again, they had this program of the physical, the social, the ecological, and the control. And at certain times of the day, you would have control of this environment. This is the area for the staff. So it's a long lineal corridor flanked by a number of buildings and sort of constricted views. And they're trying to extend that with these boardwalks and with these gathering places. And here you can see somebody walking through it. It's a very, very difficult site. It opens out to a yard on the right, which is the ball field for the entire facility. And they put some screening there. Again, it's a very rudimentary one, but gathering for the staff to talk, and then also places for individual contemplation or meditation or relaxing. There's a fire pit there as well, because they often eat their lunch there. So this was an idea that they might be able to cook there as well. I'm sorry, Amy.
Oh, no. And if I could just add, the value of having some type of a decompression space for the correctional officers is so critically important. Correctional fatigue is real, and it's really is very corrosive to work with regard to both mental and physical health in a correctional institution. And unfortunately, and very frighteningly, suicide rates are very, very high amongst those working in the correctional system. So having a nature space for them is really important.
Absolutely. And many teams did. This one
Yes.
became a sort of focus of what they were doing, but to greater or lesser degrees, the teams did. And then As you saw, they did the precedence and they brought the chickens into the main courtyard. This is the one, again, the education building here. So they had some chicken houses over here, and then they had some cultivation and learning outdoor classrooms mixed within it. So they brought some of the ideas gleaned from these precedents and international examples. And this is the maximum security. So in this case, that would be the main controlled path, and this becomes a therapeutic garden that they can use in the time that is allocated or deemed by the COs. This one is kind of, hope it works, yeah, let's try it. Yeah, I think you'll like this one. They had a flock of sheep. So you remember the goats, they went with sheep. This is twofold. One, it is for animal therapy for the inmates. As I said, many of them have serious social challenges with humans, but seem to be much more open towards an animal relationship or relationship with an animal. And also the sheep would mow the lawn. So there's no increased maintenance for the facility staff and personnel, which are already taxed. And then this is that area I showed you, if you remember, that was really encapsulated with chain link and razor wire, and they created the sensory garden there. So the idea is a few of the offenders would be in there for a given amount of time, and there would be a decompression sensory input chamber, I guess, for lack of a better word, or garden that they could use while they're being monitored by the COs or by cameras, which is generally what they're using now. There's more cameras and less CO actually observation. They also had quite a bit of water down here. So this is a stormwater detention, as I showed you before. So they have these boardwalks, and the idea was to have a physical, visual, and tactile integration into this. So for many of the residents of the facility, it's difficult to actually get away and sort of dream. And this I would call a dreamscape. It's water, it's plants, it's wildlife, it's sounds, it smells. It's really a place where you can remove yourself from where you are and restore yourself, restore your attention, restore your focus, so you can carry on in a better position afterwards. And finally, this is ebb and flow, which is really looking at the rhythmical patterns of coming and going or decline and regrowth. This was heavily embedded in an ecological approach to the campus. You can see that they're taking the water from, well, maybe you can't see, but they are taking all the water and bringing it down to the minimum security and creating this quite large and substantial water garden as the feature for that quad. They were also using native prairie and meadow plants, which they're growing on the site, which also reduces the water needs and the maintenance needs of the facility. And they perceive this as the human river that feeds into the water river and the water pond. So it's all embedded again in both the social and the ecological. So you can see it's quite expansive. These are the sustainability prison projects, hoop houses in the background, and the rest of it is really a front yard of water. This is looking up at the Central Plaza where the education is, and the 12-step program is over in this area. And this is that chain link area again. They did a similar approach to the other group that had a wandering garden. Part of it is that it's quite sad, the offenders can't run. It's against the rules. So walking is the only physical exercise in that sense that they can do. There is a sort of adage that there's the 30-pound gain for anybody who is first incarcerated because of the sedentary lifestyle that they lead. So this was really trying to create opportunity for as much exercise as permissible. The other thing is wandering. I've worked in a lot of psychiatric hospitals, is an offshoot of both mental illness and the medications given to treat mental illness. It causes an anxiety where sort of aimless wandering and walking is the result. So this would give a purposeful place for people to walk, interact with plants, and sort of meditate to hopefully regain some composure in times of high stress. Yeah, so that's what a few groups did within the 8 weeks, roughly 7 weeks, roughly allocated to the design of the master plan for the facility. At the very end, because it was so difficult to get into the facility, we were able to get into the facility, and different students this time. I think they were mostly
I
different.
think they were different, yes.
Yeah, although we could bring a lot more students, so it was almost all of the class. So yes, it was both those who had come on the visit, I'm sorry, and those who hadn't come on the visit, because we never entered the primary part of the prison. This was in the first reception place, and we didn't actually have to go through security. So this is a meeting room with all the high-powered people, head of the COs, Deborah, who is the superintendent, her staff, psychiatrist, a sociologist, and many others were there for the students to present their work. The reaction was incredibly favorable. I was kind of blown away by it. And Deborah had talked about her life. I think she's from Arkansas, if I remember correctly, and how she had had a pretty tough life. She didn't go into details, but she did say that in those situations, she also turned to nature. And that was where she found solace. So it really resonated to her that that was the approach we were taking. The head of the COs thought it was just absolutely stunning. He didn't see a lot of major safety problems in what the students were proposing. Obviously, the details would have to be worked out. And he thought that it would really help in their development, disposition, and sort of calming in general of the entire facility. He also was very touched that we had considered the staff and that the correctional officers had their own space for respite and contemplation and socializing. So I was kind of totally taken with how enthusiastic they were. We did mention the design build, and they very much want to move ahead with the design build. It doesn't seem that they'll be able to fund the design build. So that means we have to bring external money to the project if it is to happen. Of course, then COVID came and everything stopped. We also presented to the women. These were the women in the horticulture program. There were 60 of them. So we went through, presented all of the proposals, and then got their feedback. Unfortunately, this was at the end of the studio, not in the beginning or not in the middle, which we had hoped, but we just weren't able to get access to it. This is something Amy pointed out in the beginning, but you can see them talking, and their knowledge of some of these things far exceeded the students or my own, to be honest with you, because they've had so many classes in ecological design. So they were, many of them, highly versed in what we were trying to accomplish. Okay, I guess we'll wrap it up. So Amy, you want to take this?
Sure. Just some basic. We really worked with the students a lot to manage their expectations and to really help them to understand that the challenges that were associated with the studio were real. And that was actually kind of an interesting experience for students, because they had to become flexible, they had to rethink, they had to just sort of go kind of beyond some of the design projects they've worked on before, and to really look at this on a very detailed level. The other thing we really wondered about is paper design enough? Does that encapsulate really the intention of what we were trying to put forth? Again, we were working with the students to really enhance their sense of flexibility, and to be able to kind of roll with a lot of adversity, and to think innovatively, but to also think about what are some of the restrictions that are associated with designing at correctional facilities.
And Amy, if I could just add into that about the expectation.
Yes, please.
Most of the women, when we presented, not most, but many, came up and said, so when are you doing it?
Yes.
The expectation was you show it, you're doing it. And that, I think, in anybody working in this environment where there's such a huge need for it, they're used to being lied to or taken advantage of. That's a really delicate and sensitive point. And to be honest, I'm still quite ambivalent about that because we have no assurance that this will be done necessarily.
Right, absolutely. And that was a really, really delicate issue for us to address. So, we think about, what are we going to do again and what are we going to do differently when hopefully, the pandemic ends and hopefully we can get a green light on the project. But certainly I think that for many of the students, this seminar class was really transformational in terms of, the way they think about correctional institutions, the way they think about design. So it was a really wonderful opportunity.
And I believe that concludes the
it.
presentation. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. And I've asked if we have any questions. I don't see any posted from our attendees. But let me ask you, first of all, the projects were remarkable.
Absolutely.
In the future, I know you're looking at funding and all of that. If you receive the go, what would you do if you could do anything that you wanted in the future in a similar project? What would be something you'd be inspired to do?
You're talking about to implement in this particular facility.
I'm actually going to make it even bigger at any facility that would be addressing similar population.
Well, I guess the simple answer is to use the best models that are out there. And through the precedent studies, I think we showed some. So the idea of animals may seem like a crazy idea, but there's many, in Seattle now, we can have animals in our residences. So it's quite common, actually. So I don't know why that couldn't work. I mean, the people taking care of them have to learn responsibility. They have to learn that there's a dependency upon them. There's so many things that can be learned just by the act of taking stewardship on something like that. And it would really transform the environment into something that just isn't as grim. I think the idea of mixing the ecology with the social benefits of that are also really critical. I thought the waterscapes would just solve so many of the issues that we're talking about, both from an institutional standpoint and also from a personal standpoint. And I think that could be implemented and would transform the environment for everybody in a very positive way. So those are just a few of the ideas. I think the idea of having outdoor classrooms and seeing the environment as not banal and not necessarily as a threat, but as a support system for their well-being sends both a message to those who are there that we do care about you, and also gives them an idea that the whole place is about their positive development, not their punitive sentencing.
No, I absolutely agree with that, Daniel. And I also think that, it makes the possibility of the landscape serving so many potential purposes, education, wellness, sustainability, and it's just so critically important that we provide this access to everyone, regardless of whether they're in a correctional institution, they're in a hospital, a healthcare situation, an educational system, a community system. It's just absolutely incumbent upon us to provide equitable access to nature.
There's so much information, data now about the importance of exercise and its effect on mental health, particularly depression. And you can feel the depression as soon as you cross over into this facility across the board. And it just seems to me that we have the tools, we just need to implement them, and the costs are not enormous. We're not talking about major infrastructural work, we're talking about minor. And better mental health is going to be improvement for everybody in that environment. So again, these are small things that could be implemented that have been in many facilities outside the US.
Right, these small changes can have really broad positive systemic effects.
Well, thank you. We're almost at an hour, so we'll have to conclude. But I want to thank you both so much for being leaders in this area and for this inspirational talk and your project. I look forward to more submissions to work on nature. And it would be really wonderful if anyone is interested in reaching out to you. You could share your contact before we conclude.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Should we do that in the chat?
No, I would speak it.
Okay, yeah, it's a little befuddling, so I'll try my best. My email is Nina, N-I-N-A, at u.washington.edu. Again, it's Nina, N-I-N-A, don't ask, at u.washington.edu.
Great,
And sure. And mine is AWAG, like George, EN, F like Frank, E at bu.edu.
Thank you both so very much for presenting on our Learn at Work webinar. Thanks again.